Great. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another exciting Center for Educational Neuroscience seminar. My name is Yasin Arslan, and I'm a PhD candidate at UCL Institute of Education. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Thomas and Jeremy Dudman-Jones. Michael Thomas is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck, University of London. Since 2010, he has been director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience, a cross-institutional research center which aims to further translational research between neuroscience and education and establish new transdisciplinary accounts in the learning sciences. In 2003, Michael established the Developmental Neurocognition Laboratory within Birkbeck's world-leading Center for Brain and Cognitive Development. The focus of his laboratory is to use multidisciplinary methods to understand the brain and cognitive basis of cognitive variability, including a focus on neurodevelopmental conditions. Jeremy is a secondary school teacher and assistant head teacher who has taught for over 34 years in 3 large, culturally diverse, comprehensive schools in London. He has also spent 2 years teaching in a rural school in Zimbabwe. Although Jeremy is trained as a geography teacher, his background in biology meant that he has also taught A-level psychology, government and politics, and sociology. He has been responsible for running and developing his current school's very large 6th form for over 25 years. Jeremy first developed an interest in educational neuroscience after reading books by Steven Pinker and Judith Harris in the late 1990s. And he's a co-founder member of the educational neuroscience group Learnus and has spent 10 years delivering over 120 neuroscience talks and workshops as an advocate for the field. In this session, Michael will chat with Jeremy to find out how he integrates educational neuroscience into his classroom practice, where he accesses evidence, what content he communicates to other teachers, students, and parents, and more importantly, what their response usually is. So after this very long introduction, I'll just want to say, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will hand over to you, Michael and Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Yasin, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. It's a superb introduction. It's a little bit about me, but really the star of today's show is Jeremy, and I should be asking him the questions. So I think, having directed the Center for Educational Neuroscience for some time, that we're making slow but solid progress in understanding which parts of neuroscience are going to be relevant to education, the kind of learning mechanisms and the kind of factors that enhance or get in the way of learning, such as socio-emotional factors and home factors and so forth. But the big challenge that we're still facing is what that looks like in the classroom, what that looks like at the chalk face, how to implement the insights from research into actual practice in the classroom. And beyond that, how to get that kind of learning, that kind of information out to teachers. So it's been a great privilege of mine to have interacted with Jeremy over the years through the think tank Learnus. And so I had to ask, convince, plead with Jeremy eventually to come talk to the Center for Educational Neuroscience and tell us about his insights. Jeremy has been involved with the think tank Learnus for a decade and has been a really keen advocate and an excellent communicator about educational neuroscience for a decade now. And I said, Jeremy, come give us a talk. Come talk to the Center for Educational Neuroscience about your insights. What is useful in the classroom when you advocate for the importance of understanding the brain to your colleagues, or you give talks to parents, or even to primary school children? What is it they're interested in? What kind of questions do they ask you? And of course, Jeremy got back to me and said, it's just not a good pedagogic model if I just sit there talking to a camera. I want to have an interactive forum. I want a back and forth. That's a much better way to learn. So quite right, coming from an expert teacher. As we always say, teachers are the expert in the classroom. So it's my privilege then to introduce Jeremy and to prompt him with some finely honed questions to tell you a little bit about his expertise in advocating for education neuroscience, but crucially using it in the classroom. Okay, so I'm going to start off with my opening question. Jeremy, tell us, how did you become involved in educational neuroscience and what first brought it to your attention?
Well, first of all, I am honoured to have been invited, and you didn't really have to persuade me too hard, did you? Because I do like talking about education and neuroscience. So very specifically, what got me involved was a book, actually, by Steven Pinker. Actually, 2 or 3 books by Steven Pinker, and I emailed Steven Pinker, and I said to Steven Pinker, knowing that he wouldn't reply, I presume everyone knows Steven Pinker. I'm not going to tell everybody about him, but knowing that he wouldn't reply, and he did. He emailed me back, and he said, I can't help you because I'm in the United States of America, but I know that there are some people at UCL and at Birkbeck who should be, interested in finding or helping you. So I found out about the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, and Centre for Educational Neuroscience, which had been going quite a while. I don't know, how long have you been running it for, Michael? It's been going for quite a while.
2008 set up originally.
Okay. And so I managed to attend a couple of your talks, and yeah, I thought, do you know what, I'm going to continue with this thing. UCL had a chap called Brian Butterworth. I went to a couple of his talks. Danielle Lorillard, she was heavily involved in this sort of education neuroscience, trying to talk to teachers as well. And I was one of the only teachers that seemed to be interested. That, combined with the fact that I used to talk to the teacher trainers, no, not teacher trainers, the teachers that were being trained at the Institute of Education. And one of the things I wanted to get them to do was to understand what I thought was quite important about this world of psychology and this world of neuroscience. That was probably in 2005 or so. And I used to finish I had 4 or 5 sessions in the year. I used to finish my last session by talking to them about the sort of basics of the brain as I understood it back in those days. And the first time I did it, I had one of them who wasn't at all interested. So being a teacher, I sort of said, excuse me, I'm talking, you need to be listening. Thank you very much. Why aren't you at all interested? And they said, well, I really don't care what's going on under the bonnet as long as I can drive the car. And I think that's sort of what motivated me to think, well, actually, I probably should spend a bit more time trying to get to know more about what's going on under the bonnet myself, so that I can then maybe impart some of that information stroke knowledge to the teachers that I will be training. And I've been doing it ever since. So that sort of, I suppose, is a long way around. I've read a lot. You got me sort of involved through the Centre for Education Neuroscience. Steven Pinker, like that little name drop. I've never spoken to him since, but I still have that email that he sent me all those years ago. And of course, yeah, working at the Institute of Education and finding it a little bit frustrating that we weren't being, or they weren't being spoken to about the psychology, the neuroscience, the education of neuroscience. And then I got involved in Learnus. That was the wonderful Caroline Schott who suggested that what we probably needed was an opportunity for the academics to talk to, you've alluded to it, the academics to talk to the practitioners, the people at the chalk face, as you say. And I've been involved in that ever since. So listening to the words of wisdom that have come out of academia, trying to translate it into language that teachers might understand, might appreciate it. And as you say, I've been translating or trying to translate and impart some of those, the ideas that you guys have come up with over the last, certainly the last 12 years, to parents, to teachers, to primary school teachers, to CEN schools, to primary school students, A-level students, and more recently, business people as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So the guy who didn't want to look under the bonnet.
Yeah.
Did you ask him how he responds when there's like that squeaking noise that you get from the engine? where
No,
that could just be completely irrelevant, or it might mean you have to get to the garage immediately?
thankfully, it was quite a large class, and by then I'd won most of them round to my style of teaching. So they were all very supportive, and they all poured scorn in a, yeah, they didn't publicly humiliate him, but they also said, you can't say things like that. Of course it's important. What are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. So eventually he sort of relented and said, of course I want to know a little bit more about, but in those days, it was me, I'm harping back to the good old days. In those days, it was more psychology. It wasn't really neuroscience. So this idea, which maybe we're going to tease out a little bit later, this idea of neuroscience compared to the psychology. I mean, he eventually decided that he was vaguely interested in psychology and certainly the sort of social psychology side of things. But the neuroscience and the biochemistry side of things, that was what, you know, I suppose he decided that he was going to switch off at that point. So psychology, he was interested.
So even today, there seems to be quite a big focus in teacher training in psychology, and the focus on memory, and working memory in particular is quite trendy, and a focus on cognitive load theory as a type of instructional theory. Do you think the brain is much more important, that adds a lot, understanding the mechanisms about what's going on inside your head over and above those kind of cognitive theories?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm able to comment particularly on those. I think it's much more interesting and much more nuanced than just honing in on those two things. I suspect that, you know, cognitive load theory it's probably quite important. I don't really talk about it very much in my presentations because students and parents and a lot of other people, they are actually interested in some of the specifics of the neuroscience. It's weird, but they do, when you show them the brain and you talk about neurons and you talk about synaptic pruning and you talk about brain maturation, actually they do get quite engaged in that. And when you talk about the importance, I joke with the students that they all like drugs, and they all get a bit upset by the fact that I'm accusing them of liking drugs, and that allows me into conversations about neurotransmitters and, you know, what we sort of know and what people are working on at the moment about neurotransmitters. So I think it's a shame that we limit the conversations to stuff about working memory. It is important. Cognitive load is important, but plasticity is equally important. Synaptic pruning is equally important. Circadian rhythms and sleep, etc., equally important. And there's a lot of information out there. And students, I mean, especially 17-year-olds, as you know, they lap that sort of thing up. They like that sort of information. And it allows them to, in a sense, make sense of what they have been through and what they might be going through.
Right, so I want to move on to your particular practice, and then we'll talk about your communication of educational neuroscience to your colleagues. But having been exposed to the brain and how it works and educational neuroscience for a decade, which bits of it do you take into your practice currently? Which are the most important bits for you?
Well, the whole plasticity thing, I think, is inspiring for teachers. It is wonderful to think, especially if you're a primary school teacher, that the idea of plasticity exists, and talking to members of staff and talking to students about the wonders of plasticity and connections growing and that sort of idea. I mean, it just allows you to look at students in a completely different way, as in you can look at the potential as opposed to the restrictions. So I think that's, for me, very inspiring. I do like the neurotransmitter stuff. I do like the idea. I think we probably overuse the dopamine analogy a bit too much, but I do like the idea of trying to engage dopamine occasionally and trying to engage the sort of serotonin concept as well, providing a nice, calm but stimulating environment, those sorts of things. And that's I suppose, the artistry of being a teacher. If you know that serotonin is one of those very useful neurotransmitters, especially when it comes to teaching and learning, trying to find an environment that is both stimulating and relaxing and inclusive, etc., etc. I find that, as a teacher, I just find that sort of stimulating in itself. I like that. I mean, metacognition, I think we probably use metacognition a little too much as well, but students understanding what they're going through and why they're going through it. Even in my politics classes, I can talk about those sorts of things. And I'm a big fan of 50-50. So I greet the students at the door all of the time, so they know they're coming into Jones's classroom, and they get high-fived. And whether or not we do or don't believe in the importance of oxytocin, it certainly works with the students. They definitely feel more connected as you spud them or high-five. We all know what a spud is, and we all know what a high-five is. So those sorts of things. And returning to something, I mean, yeah, I mean, the whole spiral curriculum concept, if you are going to learn something, I suppose the important thing about being a teacher is that you need to be able to decide what it is that they absolutely need to retain and what they need to learn. And if you've decided they need to learn this particular concept or this particular fact or this particular skill, you better go back to it, and you better go back to it, and you better go back to it. So yeah, those sorts of things. I tell you what, recently as well, sorry, Michael, but recently, attending to their attention has also been something that is quite important to me now. Sort of making the assumption that they're going to be listening just because they're looking in my direction, and or they seem to be communicating in a group. I think now I spend a lot more time, I have done over the last 3 or 4 years, just monitoring that they are attending. And that they are actively engaged as opposed to just sort of engaged. I think teachers should be doing a bit more of that, actually, that attending to students' attention and whether or not they're attending, the student is attending to the thing that I want them to attend to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So some of what educational neuroscience talks about, maybe in a forward-looking sense, is the hope of better personalization, of understanding how children learn differently or are differently motivated or differently stressed or differently aroused or attending. Do you use any of the ideas of personalization of individual differences in how you work differently with children in the classroom?
When I talk to staff, I talk about that. I'm sort of fortunate. You alluded to the fact that what I'm doing at the moment is I look after the sixth form. So my classes are a little bit more streamed, I suppose, for one of I teach A-levels, and to get onto the A-levels that I teach, you have to have achieved certain things. So on the whole, most of my students, they like this thing called learning. They like this thing called school. They like this thing called collaborative learning. So, but I definitely do talk, and we do obviously have to engage in mixed ability teaching lower down the school. So yeah, we do the idea of personalizing things. I mean, we are all on this continuum somewhere along this continuum, and it's not really a complete revelation to understand that if I'm on the continuum somewhere, then a student is going to be either close to me on the continuum or miles away from me on the continuum. And I need to understand that, and I need to therefore try and adapt things so that I can get the best out of them. You are going to ask me a little bit later about success, and that I think is one of the sticking points of success. This personalized idea, it works very well, I suppose, almost in theory academically, but actually, and you've talked about it, being on the chalk face. Yeah, I mean, Yasin probably is aware, and a lot of people that have tuned in, hopefully, go back to the day-to-day life of a school teacher. There's a lot of behavior management. There's a lot of worrying about curriculum stuff. There's a lot of worrying about all those other bits and pieces. It's much messier, if that makes sense. So the idea of personalized, yes. Yeah, I'm sort of getting away from answering the question directly. It's easier for me. I definitely do talk about it when we do the education neuroscience training. But then expecting a member of staff, I mean, I'm going to remember they teach today. I've got some members of staff that have done 6 lessons back to back to back to back. with sometimes difficult, very hard to reach students, 25 in a class, 30 in a class, 25 in a class. So personalizing learning, I think we're quite a long way away from it. We need to be spending more time and effort and energy on seeing how we can access it, but we're quite a long way away from it. Sorry, I got a little bit carried away there, didn't I?
No, not at all. Can I push you a little bit more on the adolescent brain and whether there are particular parts of that research which seems to have been not quite a revolution, but a big input from neuroscience about the extended development of the adolescent brain, and whether you use that kind of scientific knowledge in your classroom practice.
Yeah, I mean, I try and stick to three. I think I call them the three stools of education. That sounds really unfortunate, doesn't it? The three legs of the stool on education. One of them I talk about is this sort of idea of synaptic pruning in the adolescent. That doesn't need to happen, I suppose. If we don't make them specialize, then they will be able to continue to take an interest in. So when I talk to the students specifically, I say, you know, your brain is perfectly capable of continuing to find football interesting and dance and music interesting. You don't need to just hone in on those on the academic stuff that we're telling you to. They quite like that. So the whole pruning stuff, I think, is quite important. Jay Geed's ideas on brain maturation. We talk about the brain maturation stuff, and we talk about you know, the frontal lobe and risk taking and all that sort of stuff. That they find interesting, as do members of staff. And a lot of members of staff, I think, sort of, they're a bit more sympathetic when they talk to students, having listened and understood the whole brain maturation stuff. They sort of understand that actually they're going to have to change the way they converse with the students because of the fact that a year 7 and a year 9 student in terms of brain maturation are different, and again a year 11 student is going to be different, and the way they listen to teachers chastising them, or the way they react to them, the teacher chastising them or rewarding them, is going to be different. So that's quite important. And sleep as well. I mean, a lot of work has been done by the education neuroscientists on sleep. That powerful stuff, I think, by Russell Foster on melatonin, and how there's a lag between of about an hour or so, meaning that even some of our local schools have decided that actually they're going to start their high school lessons, their lessons for sixth formers, an hour or so later. So there's definitely things that are being fed through, especially about the adolescent brain. And when you talk about, or when one talks about adolescents taking risks, I think it's also quite it's sort of comforting, I suppose, to remember Sarah Jane Bakewell used to talk about it, or has spoken about it. This idea that it's not necessarily the risk that is entailed disappointing you, the teacher. It's more the risk entailed in disappointing or letting down their social group. And you can see why, you know, me telling them they shouldn't be doing something in front of their social group, they're going to probably respond more to their social group than they are going to respond to me. So, you know, think about the context of all of these things. And when I talk about risk, remember their risk and my understanding of risk are two completely different things. You know, the risk of them antagonizing their social group far outweighs their risk of worrying about being put on detention by Mr. Jones. Not that I put people on detention, obviously.
So you've talked quite a lot about educational neuroscience giving knowledge, and that's sort of self-knowledge, knowledge about how children work and how their brains work at different kind of ages. But other parts of what educational neuroscience tries to do is work out potentially better methods, perhaps teaching and learning methods that go more with the grain of how the brain works. Do you engage much with educational neuroscience in the latest methods they suggest, or is it mainly using the knowledge, self-knowledge, pupil knowledge, and that kind of approach?
Well, I try to. Stanislas Dehaene has just written, I think, a wonderful book about learning, and he talks about the sort of principles of there are 4 principles that he talks about, and it starts with this idea of attention. One of the things that I now spend more time doing, having listened to and read his book, is I do spend more time thinking whether or not they're attending to what I want them to attend to. So my methodology has sort of changed a little bit there. And then that sort of active engagement, it's really hard to actively get students to actively engage something for most double periods. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but most schools, they've got hour-long periods, or they've got double periods of 50 minutes followed by 50 minutes. To get students to actively engage, you've got to be very realistic about that. So, you know, not rest time, but sort of different time, I think is really quite important. And then the idea of consolidation has to be built into any curriculum and any delivery method that we as teachers, we as practitioners come up with. So you have to find space, I suppose, in the lesson to do those sorts of things, and you have to find space in the curriculum to make certain you do get back to the active engagement, the consolidation, that idea. So I would say, yeah, my methodology has changed a bit. I'm still a bit quirky. I still really make a point of spending. I'm a very physical teacher, so I do spend all my time walking around and all my time communicating and connecting with students. I absolutely never sit down, so it's a very active well, my methodology is very active, and that has come from some of the studies, some of the education and neuroscience studies. So yeah, in answer to your question, yes, I have, and I will continue to, you know, act on the advice. I've forgotten the name of the person who does it. She's a very popular podcaster in the United States, and she does some great, she promotes some great ideas about the hippocampus connecting to the neocortex, and you talk to teachers about nobody's going to put the any information into their long-term memory unless the hippocampus decided that it's worth going into. And she sort of talks about it in sort of using cartoons, which is quite engaging, and it's certainly engaging for the for students and younger students in particular. Yeah, anyway, I'm rabbiting on about that, but yes, my methodology has changed.
Just one more thing I want to touch on about that interface of research and your practice. Part of the way that researchers work is they get quite focused and quite topic specific. So you'll have people specializing in, say, maths ability and maybe dyscalculia. But obviously, when you're interacting with students in the classroom, you're seeing the whole person. And indeed, sometimes a focus on improving learning outcomes is a little narrow, because it might be at the expense of, these days, anxiety and you know, challenges to mental health. So do you manage to integrate between the sort of fairly specialist bits of research coming out with the more kind of holistic interaction with your students?
I'm sort of putting that on the back burner, I think. So in answer to your question, probably not. No, I'm sort of waiting for somebody to say, go with this one. This one we're all pretty convinced about. I really engage in popular science books, neuroscience books. I really engage with, it's called Brain Science, one of those brilliant podcasts by Dr. Ginger Campbell, and she has people like Seth Grant on there, and they're really wonderful neuroscientists. But what they talk about, you know, from the synapse, glial cells, all that sort of stuff, it's not really going to make much. I find it interesting because I'm a biologist. So some of the specialist stuff, no. But I think there's enough out there that we're all pretty accepting of, that we as educational practitioners can use to inform our teaching. So I think my focus is most definitely on those bits and pieces that I think most people agree sort of work. Let's go with those. Let's make certain that everybody that is engaged in this thing called teaching and in this sort of policy decisions about teaching, they sort of accept that. We do accept that the brain changes. We do accept plasticity. We do accept that there's the importance of attention. We do accept the importance of neurotransmitters, there are certain things that we can go with. So until somebody says this particular thing happens in maths, it's not going to be something that I'm going to necessarily promote. I did mention Brian Butterworth, and we have talked about dyscalculia. It's just another one of those areas that I think it's sort of, people are still discussing it, aren't they? I mean, and what one can do about it other than therapy. I am part of another group that you're aware of called the Maths Anxiety Group, and they spend a lot of time talking about maths anxiety, but I haven't actually got any, nothing's come from it just yet, other than people are more anxious about maths than they are about reading. And I think probably, no, I won't say why.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you find out about educational neuroscience research. What are your main avenues? You mentioned podcasts. How do you find out the latest research that's coming out?
Well, I think it's one of the problems of teachers. I suppose the sort of paradox, the irony is that teachers have really specialized in what they do. So they get very good at being economics teachers, and they get very good at being maths teachers. And they sort of forget that they're dealing, as you quite rightly said, with, you know, the biology is a bit messy. It's not like physics and chemistry. It's much messier, and psychology is even messier, and education is even messier. So I sort of try and encourage all of the staff, myself included, to take an interest in as many things as possible. So I drive to work and I avidly listen to as many science programs as I can, and brain sciences in particular, and some of the psychology podcasts. There's a great podcast, I think it's from Yale University, about happiness, called the Happiness Lab, which I really like. And I'm an avid reader, so it's easy to read popular science books. They're getting more and more, you know, digestible, and they're easier and easier to read. And I think the more you do it, the easier it becomes. I don't have time, I mean, we don't have the money to buy any of the papers that you guys produce, but I do trust that some good writers, yourself included, Michael, you're able to distill that stuff, which I can then read, which I can then translate for teachers. But if anybody hasn't listened to Brain Sciences, Ginger Campbell, it's a very good podcast, as is the Happiness Lab. It's a very interesting podcast, and there are, you know, there's thousands of out there. I'm surprised that CEN hasn't done it, actually. I think that's my gift to you. You and I should do a podcast on this, or you and someone.
Jeremy, it's a deal. All right, so let's move on to communication a bit. There's a nice question put in the chat by Sophie Eleanor, who says, do you think neuroscience will be best integrated into the classroom via professional development sessions for teachers to help them understand their students better, or via neuroscience lessons for students to help them better understand their own brain and cognition? And how would you see that fitting into the curriculum? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about when you're communicating to your colleagues, what do you tell them about educational neuroscience? How do they respond, and what do you tell students? And I think you have a few slides that maybe you can give us a taste of the kind of message you give to both of those audiences.
Yeah, so I do have a few presentations. There you go. Stuff about the brain is my presentation. Incidentally, if any teachers are out there, at the moment it's still free. Learnus and I are offering these things free of charge. Where would I go through? We do a little true and false thing. It's still incredible that so many people believe that we only use 10% of our brain. So that always, yes, encourages a discussion. Left and right-sided opportunities, sensitive periods as opposed to critical periods, all of those, they do stimulate discussion. We talk obviously about Phineas Gage. I'm going to rush through these. We always do the classic. We love that one. Do you see it as, should we do that? Michael, no, we haven't got enough time. Is that white and gold? What do you see it as, Michael?
It's definitely white and gold. I don't know why there's any debate about it.
Yeah. And in fact, it isn't though. It's that one. This is the bit that I particularly talk about, and this is the bit that whoever very kindly put that question up. I do this with staff and I do this with students. So we do talk about brain maturation, we do talk about plasticity, and we do talk about synaptic pruning, we do talk about circadian rhythms and sleep and the importance of that. And we do talk about neurotransmitters and rewards, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. I've got a terrible neuron there, but it does illustrate the point. And getting them to try and figure out 86 billion of these, you have X number of connections, and those connections, blah, 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 provide or allow for plasticity. And those people that, you know, they've been economics teachers or they've been modern foreign language teachers, they've never seen this sort of, they haven't seen this sort of thing since they were at school themselves. So yeah, it's interesting to see their reaction, and their reaction is always positive, always positive. And this one, I think I've said this a few times, actually, not on this podcast, but elsewhere, that this is one of those images that I think every teacher should have in their classroom, basically, which is obviously a slice through the brain as it is learning and making those connections. And again, the response from everybody, parents, teachers, business people, I mean, people have no idea that you're born with 86 billion and that learning is basically forming connections between these neurons. It's a real revelation for people. And if anything, they go away inspired by understanding that this is what happens as you are teaching. You are changing literally the makeup of the brain, which is, yeah, it's wonderful. And it's, as I say, quite inspiring. We talk about brain maturation, we talk about the pruning stuff, and we talk about this sort of sleep stuff. And again, I credit Russell Foster with the whole melatonin thing. I think that's really important. It's really important that a young person understands, and a parent understands, and a member of staff understands that there is some biology behind this idea that students don't want to get up in the mornings and they want to go to bed much later at night, you know, and understanding why adolescents seem to do it, again, comes as a bit of a revelation to teachers and parents and students themselves. Any opportunity to get Arsenal up there, but the idea of oxytocin, the bonding neurotransmitter, yeah, again, people like, and it's sort of simple, even if there's not as much evidence as I like to think there is, that the whole physical connection, as in high-fiving and fist pumping, etc., it does seem to work. It does seem to work. And then I suppose lastly, the one that the business people quite like is, and if anyone's not read it, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is a fantastic psychology book. It's not an educational neuroscience book, but the whole idea of heuristics is another focus, really, and one that I do in particular with the business people. They do like that, and staff do. The idea of confirmation bias, which they talk about themselves anyway. They don't talk about echo chambers, which I think is increasingly talked about now anyway. The whole idea of loss aversion and why people are much more sensitive to criticism as opposed to reward. When you put it in the context of what we understand from psychology, it does start making an awful lot of sense. Anyway, that's, yeah. I've got loads more. goes on and on and on, but you probably don't want to see anymore. If anybody does, then obviously I can send it to you and you can decide whether or not you want to share it. But I've done quite a few of them. I've got, you alluded to the fact that I've done some for, I mean, it started with students. So today, for example, I have advanced entitlement classes, which are basically 50 minutes a week, where I talk to students about, well, A-level students that I'm, anything that I happen to be particularly interested in, the whole cultural capital thing. And one of the things that I start with is to do with their brains and how their brains are changing. So today, we talked about dopamine and the power of dopamine when it comes to trauma, those sorts of things, plasticity, and I did it twice. And then I also had a year 10 psychology teacher that had wanted me to come in and talk to the year 10 students about the makeup of the brain. And they're all just fascinated. They really are. I mean, it's wonderfully interesting stuff.
Have you got a primary school version? I've tried talking to 6-year-olds. I find them a very tough audience.
Yeah, they're a really tough audience, aren't they? We were laughing about them today, actually, because a fair few of our students have got younger brothers and sisters. They are a little bit crazy. Yeah, yeah. Especially when they keep asking you questions. Why? Why? Just because I've told you. That's why.
You can't use rhetorical questions in your teaching because you get like 30 hands go in the air wanting to answer every question.
The one that I do use, I don't know if there are any primary school teachers amongst those people listening. I do actually have a couple here. I am sharing that one. I do that. This is the my most recent one, that error feedback stuff and attention. But I do. That's the one for business, part of the one for business. He's fascinating. He's a very interesting person. But this one, I don't know if anyone knows Alison Gopnik. I presume people are aware of Alison Gopnik's stuff and this work by Elizabeth Bonowitz. And Alison Gopnik's written a very good book. I've really enjoyed it, called Be a Gardener, Not a Carpenter. So letting the 6-year-old do the playing and wonder at just how wonderful, impressive they are at learning new skills and focusing on the new skill stuff. My wife is in the primary sector, and I often go in and talk to her and the students about it. They like finding out about their brain. They find it a bit weird and difficult concepts to get their head around, but they like it. But the teachers really, I don't know, I think they like the idea that at that age, they understand that there are so many connections. The plasticity of the brain at that point is wonderful. It sort of gives them, I don't know, the staff a sense of wonder, and the staff a sense of, well, here we are, we're holding these people's lives in our hands. They could go in so many different directions. We better be really careful what we do in a good way. And we better allow them the opportunity to explore and play and, you know, become young scientists and understand cause and effect and that sort of stuff. So yeah, Alison Gopnik, again, she's another one that I've been to see talk a few times, and yeah, interesting, very interesting person.
So moving to the more kind of senior audience, so that other teachers and business leaders and senior leaders in schools. There's a good question here from Alexandra. Says, did you notice behavior change in the teachers, students, business people as a result of learning all this about the brain? If so, what behavioral change did you see?
Yeah, well, the whole problem with that is I often go and give my talks and then I leave the school and let them get on with it. I can only really talk about my school. I am interested in it, and so I do pursue it. So at every SLT meeting, I do sort of, they don't get bored, but they do sort of look and go, okay, what does the neuroscience say about this? And often I say, well, probably nothing. However, I would advise maybe this, and you might want to consider this. So I do talk about it there. Behavioral change in my classes, absolutely. Behavioral change in the sense that, you know, that the year 8, the naughty year 8, I'm not allowed to say that, but the year 8 student that is difficult to reach will eventually become a really engaged, hopefully engaged year 11 student. What you need to do is get them from year 8 to year 11. And because of me banging on about it, we tend not to exclude people. We tend to just, in a sense, cope with them in the school. So it's very difficult to get behavior to change immediately. But if you know that the brain matures and you can see a light at the end of the tunnel, in a sense, and you know that's going to come about by the time they're in year 11 and certainly 12 and 13. Yeah, I think it does lead to a different state of mind and a different attitude to your relationship with students. So yes, I would answer that question by saying yes. In business, I don't know, it's sort of up to the business people. I've only done 3 or 4 of those. And they're really engaged, they really like it, but they're much more interested in the psychology, that sort of Kahneman stuff. The heuristic stuff is what they happen to be interested in.
And what about the teachers' brains? Do your assistant head teachers, do they change the way they interact with colleagues based on understanding, say, factors like stress or social engagement and these aspects of brain function?
Yeah, but it does go back to our understanding of learning something, doesn't it? I mean, you do need to repeat it. You do need to repeat it. I mean, it's the same with anything. You know, I can tell staff that 86 billion neurons and they all remember it, and then you go back the next week and say how many neurons, and they've completely forgotten about it. It's been pruned away, so to speak. So if I want them to, this is terrible, but if I want the members of staff to learn something and take on board what I'm saying, I know that I am going to have to go back to it. I'm in a privileged position because I'm an assistant head and I get a chance to open my mouth, and I've been doing this job in this particular school for over 25 years. So I find myself in one of those positions where I can say things and get away with things. But I think you need the confidence to be able to do it. And you do need to understand, going back to your point earlier on cognitive load and tiredness, when you have meetings at the end of the day, like today, people are exhausted. They're not going to remember anywhere near as much. So you have to take that into consideration and think about when you're going to have your meetings, what you're going to say, the amount of things that you're going to say at those meetings. Can you get away with doing it at different times? As I say, the sort of paradox of working with teachers is they become specialized at doing their job, and they sort of think educational neuroscience, that's up to the psychologists, they can do that. You know, it's like when we ask people everybody should embrace literacy. Loads of teachers just sort of think, well, actually, that's the job of the English department. We won't do that. So you do have to work at those sorts of things. Is there a willingness to learn? There is a willingness to learn. But teachers, as with anybody, it's hard to learn something new, isn't it? You've really got to commit yourself, and you've got to be motivated to want to do it. It's hard, and we need to be realistic about that.
So you're a shining champion of educational neuroscience, from my perspective anyway, in your school. Do you think schools should be engaging with research more systematically? I know some schools have a good record of say, getting involved in education endowment foundation intervention trials. Do you think it should be something different in the structure of the way schools engage with research, or do you think it's more going to be led from individual champions like yourself in schools?
I hope not. I hope that the policymakers understand how important this is. I mean, I know that the big project that you are involved in, that Learnus is involved in, and we've tried to sort of replicate it in school. You started the whole ball game, didn't you, in school? You had the pilot scheme at Greenford High School, and we've kept it going, Michael, you'll be pleased to know. So we have these action research groups. So 3 times a year, I talk to different groups of teachers. It's never more than 15. So any more than 15, it becomes a bit of a problem. And we talk about the teenage brain, or we talk about learning, or whatever it is they want they want me to talk about in terms of the brain. And then they have to go away and they have to undertake a little bit of action research. So getting staff to take ownership of their own action research and making certain that you hold them accountable a little bit, not too much, but a little bit. So you inquire how they're doing and whether or not you can offer some assistance, etc., etc. And that's become pretty embedded in our school now. And so we have these action research groups that happen 3 times. Well, we return to it. They do one project in the year, and we return to it 3 times a year. So we set aside time. And they have to go and they have to be involved, so they know that nobody can get away with not being engaged. And it works. Yeah, I think it works. So I think schools should be doing more of it. I certainly think training institutions, and remember, you are heavily involved, aren't you, in the careers framework, the educational careers framework. As part of the educational careers framework, there's a section where you have to deliver some sort of neuroscience. I suppose I worry who's responsible for doing that at the moment, and whether or not it is just going to be hijacked by people that just want to talk about working memory. But at least it's there, so I suppose we're making some progress. Excuse me. I am going back to the Institute of Education. At the moment, I talk to the business and economic students. I've done that a while. Now the psychology, social science students want me to go along and talk. So we're making progress. But we should be talking to you guys, and we should be telling you guys what we sort of want, I suppose. And I think that needs to happen much more. in my own school, I noticed that Julie Price is I think, one of the participants. She's currently doing a PhD at Roehampton, University of Roehampton. And she's been coming in and out of school, nearly 8-9 months now, and getting really involved. And the students love it, and the staff really like it. They like the idea that they're working with academics. So yeah, I'm a great fan of it.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. So,
really? I'm sorry, I've been
no,
banging on.
Absolutely fascinating. There have been some comments and questions. Yasin, maybe you want to have a look. If there are any questions you might want to read out from the chat.
Yes, actually, there is one that is also pretty related to what I was going to ask. So I'm going to take that first. So Tim Clark actually asks, there seems to be a huge notional distance between neurons and classroom behavior. So how do we avoid extrapolating neural findings too far beyond their range of validity? So in different words, neuroscience, getting these neurocognitive mechanisms of learning into classroom or as part of teacher training, it's very dry. So how can we make sure teachers can really make the most of this evidence base?
There's nothing dry about it. Seriously? Well, it's really interesting. Even on a molecular level, it's really interesting. I mean, your brain is made up of these things called neurons, and when you learn something, you are making new connections. You're literally using your breakfast to turn on genes that then, you know, they make new connections. Dendrites connect with axon terminals, create with, crikey, it's like a drama going on there, and it's happening in this brain that you thought was, not you personally, but students thought was completely placid and yeah, non-organic, but that's not the case at all. It's a moving feast of interestingness that students are fascinated by, and actually weirdly staff are. I think I am enthusiastic about it, and maybe my enthusiasm rubs off on them. I'm a confident biologist, and maybe the fact that I have a biology background, it helps in certainly delivering it. But Tim, come to one of my talks or invite me in, and then you can decide whether or not you think it's dry. But a student understanding that to learn something requires connections, and those connections will only stay if you repeat it. Otherwise, the brain is going to do something very sensible and prune it away and use those amino acids, that protein, for something else. That's, yeah, wow. Sorry, I find that very interesting. There's nothing inert about the brain.
Actually, it was my addition to what Tim said. So Tim actually didn't say anything about.
Sorry, Tim. Sorry, Tim. Apologies.
It was my point. But you know, based on that, about the teacher training and the role of educational neuroscience in teacher training. So you kind of touched upon this, Jeremy, actually. But where do we place this educational neuroscience training? Do you think it should be part of the initial teacher training programs, or should it be delivered through continuing professional developments, or I don't know, online blogs?
Yeah, if you ask me, it would be both. You know, it's really obvious. If you want somebody to learn something, you have to return to it. You know, you're very good at doing what you do because you like it, you're motivated to do it, and you return to it. Therefore, you're going to get better at it. If I deliver one, you know, talk to a group of teachers, they'll be excited for an hour or so, and they'll think about it for the next day. But the following day and the following day and the following day, you know, I hate to go back to the term synaptic pruning, but it'll be pruned away, won't it? We know that. So unless we return to it, you know, we talk about a spiral curriculum, we talk about active engagement, and we talk about consolidation. Well, we need to do that for teachers as well. And, you know, they're busy people, so we need to find a way within the structure, within the system, to talk about it as often as we dare. So it has to happen when they first start teaching, and then it has to happen with CPD. I'm doing a CPD in school next week for new teachers, and I will deliver one session now, and then for the new teachers, we'll have another session in May, because we feel it's important. I feel it's important, and I think everybody should feel it's important. It's yeah, I think it's a vital part of teaching. After all, you're spending your time, your brain, communicating with somebody else's brain. You should know, one should know about it.
But maybe you can also highlight, Jeremy, we need to be careful about consuming evidence, because based on the evidence, especially neuroscientific evidence, educational neuroscience evidence, teachers or research consumers may find them trying to consume this evidence, but in a wrong way, let's say.
Yeah, the silver bullet is is something we absolutely need to worry about. And teachers are busy people, so they understandably cling on to some of these things that you've exposed as neuro myths. And we do need to be aware of that. We definitely do. There needs to be some level of quality control. But if you're speaking at the Institute of Education, which is part of the University College London, you would hope that somebody is there sort of vaguely listening in, thinking, well, this person's coming along indoctrinating us in stuff. But I'll go back to Learnus. I think one of the wonderful things about Learnus is, it understands that you as scientists, as a scientific community, that's what you do. You spend time peer assessing what somebody else is talking about. And you wouldn't be able to produce a podcast or a popular science book that hadn't been peer reviewed and then published, I suspect. So yeah, I trust, on the whole, I trust the scientific community. But Michael did ask that question about, maths. There are certain areas that I just don't feel I've got the expertise, but there are lots of areas where I think, on the whole, everybody here, the academics, they probably accept that plasticity is something everyone should know. They probably accept that sleep is important. They probably accept, those basic things that I'm talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, Jeremy, and I was just trying to turn the light on, actually, sorry. Yeah. Well,
yeah, I need to apologize to Tim again. You definitely did. No, apologies, Tim.
Yeah.
It was my apologies. It was my actually.
Tim says, I certainly don't think it's dry. I love it.
Yeah, good, Tim. You and I together.
From Ahmed, saying, what challenges, have you encountered in the delivery so far?
People still say I don't really need, I teach economics. I don't really care what's going on as long as they behave in front of me. Young teachers, much more interesting. I was going to finish on a bit of a sour note and say that like you, Michael, maybe not like you. I felt that it should have got a little bit further than it has in terms of policy, in terms of persuading institutions, that teacher training institutions, to more readily accept it. But actually, when I reflect on it, when I talk to young members of staff, they're much more enthusiastic about it, much more enthusiastic. So educational neuroscience is getting out there. Neuroscience is getting out there. Psychology is, it's quite sexy now, and educational neuroscience, or neuroscience, is really quite exciting. And I've got a lot more students that want to go into neuroscience. Every year I've got five or six that they want to embrace neuroscience, they want to get involved in it. So I'm quite excited now about the future. I was a little bit deflated, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, but I'm quite excited about it now.
Super. Well, we're almost at 5 o'clock.
No way.
Any other questions you want to pull up, Yasin?
Yeah, actually, I was just trying to put together some because we had burning questions here, and mostly are related to actually what kind of knowledge that teachers may need, and how we can just integrate this knowledge into what type of training, although you have touched upon this. Maybe we can just talk about a little about the possible training for teachers in the UK, for instance.
Yeah, I think we need, we need the idea of plasticity, I think, absolutely needs to be there. I think the ideas of getting teachers to attend to and understanding that unless you return to something, you're not going to remember it. The whole memory stuff, we talk too much about short-term memory and long-term memory. We don't actually talk about the mechanics of how short-term memory and long-term memory exist and why they exist. And I think we need to, be probably quite honest about that. We do need to talk more about sleep, and we do need this understanding about sleep. And the whole concept of reward, I think, is really quite important as well. And how reward equates to motivation, and Michael talks about it a lot. The sort of socioeconomic backgrounds of people is really quite important as well. That cultural capital and an understanding of who they are and what they're likely to be going through, I think is vitally important. And I think we can quite easily come up with almost a presentation, some sort of curriculum that we can deliver to most training institutions that most people would agree with.
All right. Jeremy, thank you very much for your valuable comments. And Michael, thank you very much for your comments as well. It's 5 p.m. now. We had burning questions more and more, but we cannot take any more. But
I'll come back, Michael.
It was a great session. Thank you very much all, and see you in the next CEN seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do I go now, Michael, or are we still being recorded?